So my title for this talk is Beyond Grades 2.0, which is uh, a sequel, I guess, to my dissertation. Today I'll be talking about practical applications of critical theory in community college science courses. So I figured I would start with a little introduction briefly because we already went through it a little bit, but I got my undergraduate in biology from Virginia Commonwealth University, which is the largest university in Virginia. So I was in that class, biology class, with 300 other people. Then got my master's at ECU, where I studied how aquatic or non-target insecticides affected freshwater insects. And then my PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi, and now I am at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. This MGCCC is the largest community college in Mississippi. It awards over 3,400 credentials and degrees, or types of degrees. At MGCCC, I teach microbiology and anatomy and physiology. Most of my students, just to give you an idea of the demographic, are seeking a degree in medicine. So I have a lot of pre-nursing students, radiology, ultrasound technician, dental hygiene, and some pre-med. And then I have a smaller group that aim to transfer into four-year institutions for general biology degrees. So throughout this presentation, I'm basically going to talk a little bit about my dissertation and how I'm attempting to apply what I learned under the typical constraints of a new faculty position. So I want to start with describing a major problem that I expanded on for my dissertation and one that continues to affect us. And that is, the lack of diversity in STEM education and healthcare sciences and in STEM. So for my dissertation, I focused on STEM in particular, but I figured for this talk, because so many of my students are pre-medicine, I wanted to shift a little bit to healthcare and its inability to retain women and people of color. Just to kind of describe the current gaps in representation in US healthcare, 64% of physicians are male and 56% are white. Only 6% of physicians identify as Hispanic. Only 5% of physicians identify as Black or African American. And most of the nurse practitioners, nursing, physical therapy, and occupational therapy are female. So physicians are dominated by males, and nursing and other medical professions are dominated by typically women, but only 25% of those females are non-white. And this is an issue for many reasons, but one that I would like to highlight is multi-state surveys show that 1 in 5 Black adults and 1 in 6 Indigenous adults report some kind of racial discrimination during clinical encounters. These experiences might include dismissal of pain, shorter consultation time, and even derogatory language. And these events lead to lower trust in the healthcare system, which can cause people to be afraid of seeking help, rightly so, which will delay their care and have negative health consequences. So that's what I wanted to kind of highlight and to discuss the I guess, kind of exiting from the system, or why we have this lack of representation in US healthcare. I would like to circle back to the braided river concept, which is, again, something that I used for my dissertation. So a little bit about the braided river concept. This is a contrast to the pipeline that is commonly used for an analogy of losing people as we move through the pipeline. Lots of people start in the pipeline, then they trickle out as we move forward. I've typically preferred the braided river concept because it kind of allows for a lot more diverse experiences of what it means to go through to become a STEM worker or a healthcare worker. Um, it assumes that there are multiple entry and exit points. So there are several places you could come in the system or leave the system. And exits aren't necessarily assumed to be a flaw of the system, but a characteristic. And this braided river accounts for the ebbs and flows with changing dynamics. But there are dams that block access to various channels, and these have deep historical, economic, and cultural roots. And one of those are, their experience in post-secondary science education. And that's my domain, right? Like, as a community college instructor, I have domain over dams that I may or may not construct. My classes, anatomy and physiology and microbiology, are typical weed out classes. They have high, typically high D fail and withdrawal rates. So that's kind of what I wanted to highlight, because now the situation has changed where I actually have agency over whether or not I construct these dams at a post-secondary education level. So this is a figure that I made for my dissertation, and it's got a lot going on, so I'm just going to go through the parts really quick. I promise it connects. So in the center here, and this is really what I like to call the positive feedback loop of the loss of diversity due to neoliberalism and associated meritocracy. So this idea that if you work hard, you can be successful, and being successful means making money. So that's the connection between the meritocracy and neoliberalism. So in the center, I have these underlying assumptions from post-secondary education, society at large, and neoliberal values. And I'm going to focus on the blue, the post-secondary STEM education, because again, that's my domain now. And on the outside, we have these mechanisms that are driving these relationships. So at the post-secondary STEM education level, we have typically an emphasis on rote memorization and quantitative student measurement. Current practices favor the dominant cultural group's success, so that's typically the white middle class. And we have this reproduction of this singular Euro-Western epistemology, it's literally reflected in any science class you walk into. That's what you're seeing. And this itself leads to those losses of diversity, or presents a dam in the braided river. And so how that connects to the rest of this positive feedback loop is inclusion of marginalized groups is seen as a threat to the status quo. So those meritocratic ideals justify the unequal distribution of power and resources. So if we say we're going to measure everybody exactly the same with a quantitative assessment, but there are certain groups that have been basically cultivated to succeed in quantitative assessments, we kind of can use that as an excuse to justify this unequal distribution of power. So circling back to these losses of diversity from post-secondary STEM education, the way that I see this manifest is through things like weed out classes, those that are designed basically to pull a lot of people out of the system that aren't living up to this meritocratic idea of a high numeric score success. Less access to STEM resources early, stereotype threat, gender and racial biases in the actual content, and the fact that scores are the way that we assign value to students, and subsequently the way that they assign value to themselves. And the critique of this entire system I kind of designed in this figure is all derived from critical theory. So I'll talk a little bit about critical theory, but I'm sure you're all probably familiar at this point. But this promotes a critical view of existing structures that harm underrepresented groups in healthcare science specifically, since that's what I'm focusing on now. Dominant cultural privilege typically leads to both oppression and racism of various forms, which perpetuates inequality in power, law, and education. Those systems of power actively and systemically work against those of different sexes, genders, abilities, and races than the dominant group, which creates discrimination and exclusion. And to circle all of this back, the the main reason we need to critique the system is to make sure that people are getting the best and highest quality healthcare that they possibly can, because healthcare is a human right and everyone deserves access to healthcare. So here's my problem. I was kind of hired very, very close to the beginning of the semester. So this is definitely a reflection of my lived experience, but how can we take inherited science courses and enhance them to align with critical theory values while accounting for the limitations that often accompany a new teaching faculty position? So just a little bit more about my experience, because there are likely an infinite ways to accomplish this goal given each individual's strengths and limitations. But when I was hired, I basically received these inherited courses. So I got some Canvas shells, I got PowerPoint slides from the previous instructor who retired from this position, which I have no idea when those were made or how old they are, and a textbook, and then the slides that are associated with those textbooks. And again, that's around like 3 weeks prior to the beginning of the fall semester. A little bit more context, I teach 6 classes, both in person and online. So my main limitation is time and energy. So what I did was I tried to start small. And this basically came from making adjustments to content, since that's what was most accessible to me at the time. There are a few pedagogical adjustments that I made, but it's definitely nothing big. And that's, I think, kind of my point, is that you have to start small. And so I did that by trying to contextualize science within, the context of larger issues, improving representation in my course content, and updating the truths of science. And so, those, I'm going to go through a few examples, just a few short vignettes of how I implemented these in my courses. I made some other changes as well, but these are the ones that I wanted to share with you all. So I will start with contextualizing science. So I attempted to situate science in sociopolitical, cultural, and historical contexts. So this first example is from my anatomy and physiology class. So I tried to kind of historically contextualize the information that we have on anatomy and physiology, because if you look through actually lots of anatomy and physiology textbooks, I know my Pearson textbook had absolutely no mention of the history of anatomy and physiology. Unlike when you crack open like a microbiology textbook, you're going to see all these white guys and their great contributions to microbiology. But in anatomy and physiology, you won't find it, and that's for a very particular reason, and it's because the history of A&P is incredibly dark. So I'll lead with that, a brief note on the history of anatomy. And these are directly from my PowerPoint slides. So a lot of the information that we have about anatomy initially comes from grave robbing, without permission from the person or from their family, dissection and experimentation on executed criminals, people committed to asylums, enslaved people, etc. I also talk a little bit about our mothers of gynecology, with the gynecological experimentation on Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy, and other enslaved women performed without anesthesia or their consent. Much of the information that we know about fistulas come from experimentation on these women. And I talk a little bit as well as the Nazi concentration camps in Unit 731, and how the United States, has information from these experiments performed on people who were in these concentration camps and in Unit 731. In fact, the US granted immunity to Unit 731 leaders in exchange for their anatomical and medical data. And I also do this for another reason, not just to share the sources of our information, but to kind of validate lingering fears of the medical field. Various groups have been, as we see here, marginalized and exploited by medical fields and health sciences. And that's still happening today. In the 1930s, we had the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and that was not that long ago. So we have these lingering fears, and these fears have validity to them. And so that's why another reason I think that it's really important to highlight this pattern of subjugation and exploitation that we see of certain groups of people, while other groups of people have the agency to do the research. So I have an assignment that that we will do as a class, typically individually or in groups. You could do this, where it's kind of like a knowledge tracing experiment, where first students will determine a system. So they'll choose one of the biological systems that we're going to be going through throughout the course of the semester. So that would be like cardiovascular, nervous, lymphatic, digestive, reproductive, whatever they want. And this is good because this is going to happen within like the first week of class. So they're starting to build familiarity with all of the body systems that we're going to discuss in anatomy and physiology. Then I will have them build a timeline. So they'll identify 2 to 5 milestone researchers and note the year, the place, the method, and the key finding for each. And we're building those research skills. We're building the synthesis skills. Then they'll locate a piece of primary evidence for each. So they'll find at least one excerpt. This could be an image, a piece of art, even because some of these were happening before a camera. Lab notebook scans from the original work. And here we're working on our primary source literacy, what it means to be primary source. And lastly, we have this context and ethics section, which is going to be a 300 to 500 word reflection. Although I've tried out the reflection, I've tried out a little presentation. So this is really fluid in the way that it can be done. But they'll respond to the social conditions that enabled the work, if consent was obtained, and who benefited and who suffered. And here we're actually doing some good critique of where the information came from. So here is a potential example of what a student might come up with during this knowledge tracing activity. So say, for example, the student chose the nervous system. There are many, many different potential researchers that they could have come up with. A big one, though, is Herophilus, which is 3rd century BCE, who was the first to distinguish motor and sensory nerves and reportedly performed vivisections, which is live dissection, on condemned prisoners. They may also find Luigi Galvani, who performed frog leg experiments showing animal electricity in 1791. And the ethical origins that they may pull out of that would be direct non-consensual experimentation on living, vulnerable humans and on animals. So this assignment and the associated presentation, it really exposes the very dark history of our current anatomical and physiological understandings. And when students trace discoveries to a particular time or to a particular place, it demonstrates that science is situated within that context and not timeless. And they have this opportunity to talk about who supplied the bodies, the animals, or the data, and who had the agency to do the research. So who was the researcher and who was the object that they were researching on. And and that's the main goal with this. But I will also mention that I have had students find non-Western marginalized contributors that typically get left out of these stories, and that helps to decenter this Euro-American narrative of this is who performed the research and here this is who was the subject of the research. So it presents that opportunity as well, which I have really appreciated. So the next vignette I want to go through is on improving representation, which I think includes incorporating underrepresented people for fuller biological understanding. So this second vignette is from my microbiology class. So I'm going to show you an example from a slide that I pulled from the textbook Supplier McGraw-Hill. And this is a slide on hand, foot, and mouth disease. And you notice that this is a skin disease. It's diagnosed using the rash on the skin, specifically on the hand, the foot, the mouth. And I would say that, especially in this, skin disease chapter, darker skin only appears in around like 10% of the slides, and that's a pretty generous estimate. So this is a really, really super simple update that I made to slides, is just providing representation for what these diseases look like on darker skin tones. So a very straightforward update to the PowerPoints, and I'll do that, any slide that or any disease that we talk about that involves anything from the skin, we absolutely have to have representation for what that looks like on every skin tone. So I will also give an associated assignment for this concept as well that tries to tie in different representations of diseases on different skin tones that might deviate from how textbooks typically teach these diseases. So we'll do a case study assignment. We do case study assignments all the time. They're a very common part of any microbiology class, especially medical microbiology. So we'll do a case study. Although these case studies, especially in community college level or undergraduate level microbiology, will follow your stereotypical red rash on light skin, right? So I try and incorporate diversity in the case studies that we see. So this example of this case study is a 6-year-old South Asian girl who is at pediatric urgent care. And her presentation reported by her mother is a 2-day history of sore throat, low-grade fever. Today we've had vomiting once, poor appetite, itchy sandpaper skin on chest and arms. No visible redness, but the skin feels rough and bumpy. And some physical exam notes include a temperature of 100.8, swollen tonsils with a white exudate, a fine raised papular rash on chest and axillae or armpits, no visible erythema, which is redness. We also have this note from a medical assistant: rash doesn't look like strep rash because there's no redness. Maybe eczema, mom seems anxious. And this is a hypothetical example of a case study, but these are all situations that have absolutely happened. So the diagnosis in this case, maybe you've already come to this conclusion, is scarlet fever, which is an incredibly dangerous disease that, if left untreated, can progress to bacterial meningitis, pneumonia, endocarditis, sepsis, and death. And it typically happens after strep throat and infection from Streptococcus pyogenes becomes systemic and starts causing this like runaway fever. And it's called scarlet fever because in lighter skin tones, it causes a red rash. But in darker skin tones, a rash is not common, actually. You have these raised papular rashes that could be mistaken for things like hives or eczema or something else. So they'll read through this case study. We'll do a little bit of discussion. But again, this is a disease that used to kill off children like nobody's business in the 20th century before antibiotics. but just want to emphasize that early intervention is the key to prevent meningitis, pneumonia, endocarditis, and sepsis. So here are some of their discussion questions. What is your leading diagnosis, and what key features support it? Why might the classic description of the rash, red and sandpaper-like, lead to misdiagnosis in this case? What diagnostic test would you order to confirm your suspicion? What are the potential complications of untreated scarlet fever? How might training that relies heavily on light-scanned images contribute to diagnostic delays or errors? And how could the assistant's note reflect unconscious or conscious bias? And what I want to emphasize about these discussion questions is that we're weaving together really important microbiology content. I mean, Streptococcus pyogenes shows up in strep throat, rheumatic fever, scarlet fever, glomerulonephritis. So strep pyogenes is a really, really important pathogen that they will absolutely need to know in their future medical care. But they will also need to understand that diseases present in a variety of ways in people with different phenotypic characteristics. People who look different will present with atypical, or I guess it's not even atypical, it's typical for that skin tone, but it will present in ways that aren't taught in your, microbiology textbook. And this is to emphasize that all bodies are important, and to teach with only pictures of light skin communicates that those are the only ones worth learning about. And I hope that this would also lead to better preparation for their careers, where they will see all kinds of people, and hopefully encourage better treatment and outcome for those with darker skin tones. Because not only in the healthcare system do we see this direct discrimination just from unconscious or conscious bias, but you're also seeing mistreatment because of that professional's entire educational background. The fact that dark-skinned images weren't taught in their microbiology classes. So that kind of all compounds and leads to poorer health outcomes for marginalized people. And this third and final aspect that I wanted to talk about is updating the truths of science. So this involves reevaluating and updating typical science or science-ish narratives. So my vignette 3A, there are only two sexes. And we see this in anatomy and physiology, of course, because we have to teach male reproductive anatomy and female reproductive anatomy. And very rarely do we talk about the in-between. So the previous and far more pervading paradigm, which also includes people who, intentionally use science in bad faith arguments, is that each person has a set of chromosomes, either XX or XY, and that determines their biological sex. Female if XX, male if XY. And that is, at its simplest, what is most often taught. But we have this developing paradigm, which scientists have known about the aspects of like the complexities of sex development in people. But it's really growing a lot of, it's growing a lot of attention recently. So I'm going to show you this updated developing paradigm where we have chromosomal sex, which even here we see a bit of a spectrum emerging, which a person can have one X chromosome, two X chromosomes, three X chromosomes, XXY, XYY, and XY. Those chromosomes potentially determine gonadal sex because there are these genes that travel on the chromosomes. So that includes the SRY gene and around 300 other genes that can determine gonadal sex, so whether there are ovaries or whether there are testes. And then that would potentially lead to hormonal sex, so which hormones are being pumped out when, at what point in development, and that would perhaps determine anatomical sex or phenotypic sex. But I want to highly emphasize that even this is incredibly oversimplified. So I'm going to show you a kind of wild diagram in the next slide that really gets at how complex a process this actually is and moves us away from there are only two sexes into sex is a spectrum. So this is a map, basically, where we have factors that determine sex on the left-hand side, and that includes, again, the chromosomes, genes, hormones, internal and external sex organs, and they've included here as well secondary sex characteristics that develop at puberty. So let's just want to focus on one example of these complexities. So say, for example, we get a set of chromosomes in a developing fetus that is female, so two X chromosomes. Typically, with two X chromosomes, you will not see the SRY gene because the SRY gene travels on the Y chromosome. However, sometimes during development, or during meiosis, we'll actually see some crossing over and exchanging from X chromosomes to Y chromosomes. And a Y might exchange with an X and might give the X chromosome the SRY gene. So yes, we may have the absence of the SRY gene. However, we may have had crossing over, and now you have a chromosomal female who has a gene that is called the male hormone because it causes the growth of internal testes that may or may not descend. So a person might not even know that they have internal testes. So we might have this SRY gene be present on a chromosomal female, which is going to cause an intersex condition and fall somewhere along that spectrum. But even with a typical biological female who has two X chromosomes, who has no SRY gene, and has your typical internal and external female genitalia and gonadal structures, even slight variations in hormones, excess testosterone, might cause male phenotypic traits at puberty. So what I hope to emphasize by showing this to my students and is really to get through to them that the real story is much more complex with many different trajectories to various places on the sex spectrum. So not only does this update students with our current scientific understanding, that it actually also improves representation and validates people's existence. So here are some examples of how I changed my language to reflect this updated science concept. So sometimes I might see in my PowerPoint both sexes, and this is a really easy transition to all sexes, everyone, things like that. Another one that we'll see frequently is things like blood pressure tends to be higher in males since they produce more red blood cells. I might change that to higher levels of testosterone cause the body to produce more red blood cells, leading to higher blood pressure. Then this is actually one that we just did because we just finished up female reproductive systems. Females are more likely to experience osteoporosis. Can easily be updated to say after menstruation has stopped during middle age, decreased estrogen levels can lead to osteoporosis. And these are actually more accurate scientific statements because it's not about sex. It's about the mechanism. It's about the mechanisms within the body that have these cause and effect. So a person's blood pressure isn't high because they are male. it is high because they typically have higher testosterone and more red blood cells. And it also helps prevent people thinking that, oh, I won't have high blood pressure because I'm female, or there's no way I can get osteoporosis because I'm male. So taking out the sex-specific language is not only more scientifically accurate, but it's more inclusive and more representative. So the last one, vignette 3B, is deconstructing race as a biological predictor of disease. We have obviously known for a while now that race is a social construct and not a biological one. But oftentimes in science textbooks, they will state these, put these blanket statements about racial differences, but give no explanation as to the underlying cause of those differences. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what I have seen in my inherited PowerPoints and textbooks, including from my previous or my predecessor, as well as Pearson and McGraw-Hill. So some observed racial differences. Black people have higher blood pressure on average than white people. The PowerPoint just said that. No context. White men have higher rates of oropharyngeal cancer, but Black men are more likely to die from it. And lastly, Native Americans are genetically prone to diabetes, which is just flat out wrong, but I've seen it. So anytime I see any kind of statement like this, I give a quick update, correct it if I need to, and we actually talk about the underlying cause. It is well accepted in the scientific community that the main reason that Black people tend to have higher blood pressure on average than is because of the constant stress of daily and systemic racism. This second one, white men have cancer, but Black men are more likely to die from it, is a classic example of how white men and white people in general typically have better access to healthcare and are diagnosed more and are diagnosed earlier. So they will have higher rates of diagnosis and better prognoses, whereas Black people often go undiagnosed, either because they're not taken seriously or because there's this lingering fear of treatment, which again is completely valid. So their illnesses, especially cancer, are caught later and they have a worse prognosis and therefore are more likely to succumb to their cancer. And then lastly, Native Americans are genetically prone to diabetes. Native Americans have higher rates of diabetes because of historic subjugation, less access to high quality food. They have more access to, or they only had access to foods that were high in saturated fats, poverty, and historical trauma. So again, it's not about race, it's about the mechanism. And these underlying causes, although they are social causes, but they also have that aspect of scientific authenticity, right? We're not seeing a biological difference in race, but using our science brains can come to an underlying cause. So kind of finishing up here, through these changes, I hope to cultivate critical thinking in my students, to foster empathy and inquiry, to inspire students to challenge norms and follow their curiosities, to make spaces safer for underrepresented students, and to start rebuilding trust that has obviously been lost, and to make this truly a safe space where everyone can succeed and everyone has the opportunity to go on to help people in their healthcare field. So a few of my future directions: I would like to perform further curriculum revision. I've got all summer to do it, so that's what I'm going to focus on next. try to add more counter narratives on the histories of scientific discoveries, because again, they are so Eurocentric. I want to incorporate the impact of colonialism and capitalism on biological phenomena like antibiotic resistance in microbiology. I would also like to do more pedagogical transformations, so decentering traditional exams in favor of less punitive, more creative assessments, and incorporate culturally relevant pedagogy infused with my inquiry-based activities that I've already added and active learning activities that I've added. And then lastly, I would love to make some interdisciplinary partnerships because we've obviously seen connections to history, to sociology. And I always hear my students talking about what they're doing in this class, what they're doing in that class. And it reminds me of how discrete all of their classes are. So I'd love to infuse some interdisciplinary assignments to kind of make their college experience a little bit more holistic and kind of show the connections between science and all of these other contexts. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much, and I'll take any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Dr. Sorey, for your insightful and engaging presentation. We have about 15 minutes for the questions and comments. Just feel free to leave them in the chat, so I will monitor this, or just unmute yourself and direct your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you, Emma.
Dr. Sorey?
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sandy Moss. I'm a PhD student in the Center for STEM. And thank you. This was a fabulous presentation. I learned so much and really appreciate everything that your work is doing, as well as helping to lay a foundation, which leads me to my question. Do you think your work on the microbillions, because I actually love that term, and the framework that you're starting to put together for it, do you think that could be applied across all disciplines in educational levels? You know, so for educators like in math, history, or even like early childhood education, to use kind of similar
Yeah.
shifts to challenge the dominant narratives?
What a wonderful question. And yeah, absolutely. I think the experience of being new is so incredibly universal, and kind of like focusing on the teacher or instructor of any of those classes, all the way from, childhood to post-secondary. Again, the feeling of being new is pretty universal and kind of feeling overwhelmed. So the small steps, I think, are the most impactful. And all it takes is some critique, just critiquing what exists and finding little places where you can make changes. And eventually, they begin to accumulate until you've got a course that is a far cry from what you originally had.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And Anne-Marie asked, have you noticed your students responding to these changes? Yes and no. So I think that my students are a little hesitant to talk about these kinds of things in class. I have noticed an uptick in curiosity, which I love. When we talk about reframing these ideas, especially with the more than two sexes, I will get a lot of questions about, oh, well, what happens when this goes on? What happens when this goes on? So I think at the very least, I'm noticing a little bit more curiosity on these subjects, which I absolutely love. We'll see when I get my student evaluations if they have any further comments on it. And
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question was, well, I'm not in STEM, but I'm super interested in STEM. I'm a theater major, but I was interested in this talk today. Have you encountered resistance for these like methods that you're using, whether that be from students or administration or anything like that?
Yeah, another amazing question. Surprisingly, I don't get a lot of resistance from my students. And I don't know why. If I think maybe that what I've been doing a lot of, self-reflection, and I think the voices that scream, there are only two sexes, are very loud and mask most people's understanding, which is a little bit like, well, I've heard this, but I don't really actually know. And so I think that maybe one day I'll get, pushback from a student, but for right now, my students have been super open and accepting with the information that I'm providing them. And I think that providing these like active learning assignments along with that allows them to discover it on their own and not just from me like feeding them that kind of information. And then the second part of your question, administration wise, MGCCC has this thing called academic freedom, where I'm allowed to teach my course however I want, as long as I'm teaching the required material. So far, I have not had any pushback from administration.
That's good. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Samantha, I can answer your question, and I know there are some in the chat, and I'm going to try and get to those as well.
Hey, it's so nice to see you. I'm glad you're doing so well over there.
Yeah,
Um,
you too.
so I wanted to know if you have, so for my research, I'm going to try to incorporate environmental justice case studies as a way to deliver content. So it's very similar to what you're doing. I wanted to know if you are only using the textbooks, or if you have like a repository, or if you're using just other sources of literature to supplement your data.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. So it was kind of muffled, but you asked like where I'm getting my case study resources. Okay, cool. So I have actually gotten them from my medical student friends who have given me a lot. But I will say when I need to, that's because that's medical school, and I'm definitely not teaching medical school. I use ChatGPT to help me edit things that, need to be a little bit more simplified or clear. And so I found that to be an excellent resource.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, my email. Okay, so Lucy Harper asked, with the new DEI regulations in Mississippi, are you having to adjust your curriculum further, especially with your teaching of human sex and there being more than just XX females and XY males? Yes, I am adjusting my curriculum further. I'm doing it more. I'm going even harder than I was because I feel now that it is more important than ever for me to take a stand for what the science says about that. Andrea Krell, do you see receptivity in your higher ed colleagues for making similar adjustments to their work? That's a good question, and I don't know. We are kind of isolated, but this is my first summer off, and it seems that that's when everybody like talks and gets things ready for the next semester. So I might pitch a couple of these things this summer and see how it goes. And I think, Emma, that kind of answers your questions as well. Have I inspired or encouraged any of my other faculty to update presentations or language? Probably not yet, and that is fine because I am new. I'm just a baby here. And so nobody really, nobody wants to evaluate my performance just yet, which I'm kind of appreciative of because I'm still getting my bearings. But I did encourage my supervisor, who's wonderful, to get us some dark-skinned anatomical models, and I think that has kind of set a standard, because those anatomical models hang out in the room where everybody else teaches. So they're seeing these things show up, and maybe it gets the gears turning. I'm not really sure, but I'm looking forward, hopefully, to a very long career here, where I think maybe one day I will be able to inspire, encourage other people to make these kinds of changes. Knock on wood. Thank you.
I just have to say hello, Caroline.
Hi.
See
So good
you.
to see you.
Students are so lucky to have you, and it's cool to
Thank
see
you.
education is evolving into practice and all these meaningful ways. And I'm glad that so many people are here to hear you talk about your work because it's really powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. If you could just tell my students I'm doing a great job, because at the end of the day, they're still students, you know. Undergraduate. Love them. Love them so much.
We have a few minutes left. If you still have questions, we have some time. I really appreciate your presentation, Dr. Sorey. And actually, I want to ask kind of your insights as a new PhD graduate and kind of transitioning into a teaching job. Do you have any maybe suggestion that you can leave us with?
That's a great question. I would say, I can only speak to a transition from PhD program directly into strictly teaching. And man, I'm teaching 6 classes. So I would say your best resource will be your colleagues, and they are typically so open to giving you all the resources they have. And I think that's how you start to make things your own, is you see how the different instructors are teaching. You take what you like from each one, you add your own flavor to it. So I would say make it easy, and again, starting small, I think, has been the most important thing for me, is just not trying to do it all in the first year, just trying to, again, make those tiny changes that end up being, not very time consuming.
So yeah, you say start small, but I think seeing your presentations and the cases, I feel like it is a lot to process, not like processing. I mean, it gives a lot of details into why you are doing this work, and it's really proving that, it's scientifically accurate and also inclusive, as you mentioned in your presentation. I'm really, inspired by your work. And it's
Thank
new.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of new idea, new research area for me. So I'm really excited by it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other comments or final questions before we leave?
Ooh, I have one. So advice thinking about for students, so because I know Dr. Usel is going to share this with her grad students. Looking back on your dissertation to where you are now, would there be anything you changed about your journey, or like how you viewed your work then versus now, that type of thing?
I would say I wouldn't change a single thing, because it all led to where I am now. But the second part, which was, can you repeat the second part of the question, I guess?
I don't know what I said.
Let me try. I do that all the time.
Just thinking about like what, you're looking back on where your research is and seeing, how did you think about it
Yeah.
then? Think about it now, I think is something to think about, maybe talk about.
Right. I get what you're saying. So I think at the time, it was not theoretical, because it was applied research, what I did, but I wasn't like actually in the classroom. I was developing these surveys. So it was from a very third person lens. of course, with my own subjectivity added to the research. And now that I'm in this teaching position, I'm actually like, seeing the things that I wrote about manifest in my classroom. I'm seeing the effects of inequitable K-12 education. And that just kind of, makes me view that with a much more like, now I'm facing it head on, and it definitely serves to solidify what I did for my dissertation. And I'm so glad I did that, because I'm so glad I got my PhD in STEM education, because I truly feel like I'm beginning to be an expert in, science education. And man, I feel so well prepared, I will say that, for making these classes what I want them to be.
That's a great insight. Thanks for sharing your experiences and your work with us. I think that wraps up our final speaker in this series today. So I want to thank each of you for your thoughtful participation and engagement. I hope you all enjoyed the talks as much as I did, and we look forward to seeing you at future talks. Thank you.